right, welcome back, everyone. I think in the interest of time, we'll get going with our first of two afternoon sessions. Our first speaker, Ildar Garbzonov, comes to us from the University of Oslo, and also this semester, very nicely, by way of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And I'm very happy to introduce him in his paper on early medieval monograms from 300 to 900 of the Common Era. I always have to say which side of zero we're on from my work. From producers' marks to liminal graphic devices. Ildar.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Professor Bordell and Houston, for inviting me to such a wonderful conference that I find quite relevant to my general research interests. And now I have to explain a little bit the methodological background for what I'm going to present. And I'm coming to this topic from a more general interest in graphicacy. And this term probably familiar to some of you because it actually can be found in Webster and Oxford English Dictionary, so it's a legitimate term. But it was introduced only in the mid-60s, mostly in Britain and South Africa, so maybe it's less known in the United States. And people who introduced that term were mostly working with diagrams and maps, and they were working with in educational studies, psychology related to high schools, and they argued that the set of skills that people use for learning and processing and creating diagrams and maps are entirely different from literacy and numeracy and oracy. So they suggested that graphicacy is the fourth mode of communication, the fourth main mode of communication that needs to be taught in school. So the founder, the person who invented this term, Bauchin from England, he actually was saying that although most people work with diagrams and maps, but in some of his later work, he was mentioning all kinds of graphic science and marks as a part of graphicacy. But this particular type of graphicacy wasn't really studied by modern scholars, because they are more interested in more complicated forms like Feynman tables, diagrams, and so on. But when I go back to my time, late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, then diagrams and maps would be a very rare occurrence in all kinds of media. So if you look at early medieval manuscripts and think how narrow access to this kind of media was in that period, then we are talking about less than 1% of population were able to operate with such complicated forms of graphicacy as diagrams and maps. So most people were acquainted with graphicacy, or they used skills related to graphicacy through the use of different signs and marks. Modern specialized studies in graphicacy didn't pay attention to this particular part, and I suggested that we have to speak about early graphicacy as different from modern ones, but using the same set of human cognition, the same set of skills related to specific visual, spatial abilities of human cognition involved in this process. And my own research project deals not with all kinds of graphic science and marks, but with graphic science that have specifically some symbolic or transcendent properties. And I call them graphic science of authority. And that's what I'm doing. And monograms is one of the types of those science that I am going to discuss today. Greek monograms, usually composed of a few letters conjoined within one graphic structure, appeared on coins in classical Greece, and their use became widespread in the Hellenistic world. And you can see an image of that Greek monogram on the coin on the screen. And they primarily functioned as control marks referring to low officials or masters responsible for their production. The practice of such monogrammatic stamps continued into the early imperial period, when it appears not only on coinage but also on other mass-produced objects such as glass vessels and pottery. But it was late antiquity when the use of monograms on various material artifacts became ubiquitous. In that period, they began to be stamped, carved, inscribed, and drawn on various new media, namely public monuments, ivory diptychs, silverware, dress accessories, weights, seals, manuscripts, and so on. By that time, the structure of monograms has also changed. Late antique and early medieval monograms were expected to consist of all the letters of encoded words. No longer limited to the function of pragmatic control marks, they developed into more sophisticated visual devices, encoding personal names and ritualistic phrases such as acclamations and intercessory prayers. In short, late antique monograms departed from their classical precursors not only in terms of their quantitative scope, but also in their contextual functions and the messages they communicated. And in my presentation, I would like to overview these functions and messages that made such graphic devices quite different from their classical predecessors. In the 3rd century, the first Greek monograms began to be carved in Roman catacombs. In most cases, they were inscribed on epitaphs to place visual emphasis on the name of the deceased Christian or a specific Christian wish. From the 4th century, Latin monograms appeared in the same context to encode personal names and short acclamations. Personal monograms did not only express the name of the deceased, but also the name of individuals who commissioned funerary inscriptions for their deceased relatives. And in such cases, personal monograms functioned almost like producer's marks. Over the course of the 4th century, it became relatively common to inscribe personal monograms of the deceased without any accompanying text, not only on funerary plaques, but also on marble sarcophagi. Such monogrammatic signs functioned as quasi-images to passers-by and as paratext to relatives and friends of the deceased. The acclamatory monograms that were occasionally used in Roman catacombs in the 3rd and early 4th century became especially popular graphic marks from the second half of the 4th century. One such mark became especially popular in Rome, both underground and on the ground. This monogram is composed of the letter P and E and is often accompanied by the image of a palm leaf. No textual source refers to this monogram, but its frequent usage indicates that its meaning was known to many Romans. Since this monogram appears not only in funerary epigraphy, but also in circus context, modern scholars usually decode it as a triumphant acclamation, palma et laurus, or the palm and laurel. This acclamatory monogram thus originated in a circus context and was adopted by early Christians to mark their belief in the triumph of the Christian cause and their ultimate salvation. In the 5th and 6th century Greek East, the practice of acclamatory monograms can be traced to the towns of Asia Minor, such as Aphrodisias and Ephesus. In these cities, supporters of circus factions carved acclamatory monograms on marble surfaces in the central streets of both cities in the period from the mid-5th to early 7th century. Some of these graphic devices only hide the name of a faction in the genitive, the greens or the blues, with the rest of the phrase spelled out in the epigraph, while the others encode the entire abbreviated acclamation, the fortune of the greens triumphs. It has been suggested that such monograms were carved as visual records of acclamations recited during ceremonials performed by each competing faction. If this was the cause encoding the whole phrase or the name of the faction on whose behalf the acclamation was carved on stone, must have been perceived as expanding its repetitive power in time, beyond its purely oral qualities. The circus factions are also known as one of the main causes for gang-like violence in early Byzantium. And the factions' monograms also can be viewed as a form of tagging, making each gang visible in public space. Several factors contributed to the late antique expansion of monograms outside their original sphere of usage as control marks, and I now would like to mention them briefly. Firstly, changes in the Roman onomastic practices facilitated the growing usage of Latin personal monograms in the 3rd and especially 4th century. In the late Republican period, the traditional Roman full name consisted of 3 or 4 elements. It's first name, family nickname. And what happened, and of course it was almost impossible to express all 4 names in one monogram. What happened that by the 4th century, the prenomen, or the first name and the family name became all but marker of status, while various cognomina or family nicknames of Latin and Greek origin, as well as Christian names, which were treated as cognomina, developed into the main individualizing element in naming practices, especially among Christians. And cognomina of this kind formed the basis for a single name system that became typical of the early Middle Ages. It's these new single names that late antique personal monograms predominantly represent. Secondly, belief in the evil eye and a fear of the misuse of personal names in magical practices must have contributed in late antiquity to the spread of inscriptions where personal names were replaced by anonymous formulations such as whose name God or whose name the Lord knows, without any name. Personal names needed to be protected, so to speak, against adversaries, both of this world and of the other world. Since some late antique cursing spells targeted the performers of one of several competing circus factions, the same reasoning can be applied to the appearance of the above-mentioned epigraphic monograms hiding the names of the circus factions in Ephesus and Aphrodisias. Monograms could thus be deployed as visual devices, either offering honors to or preserving the memory of factions or persons whilst protecting them from hostile agents. The same logic explains, for example, why some theater seats in Aphrodisias were marked not with full names of their owners, but with their box monograms. Thirdly, the fact that many personal monograms appeared on funeral tabulae in early Christian catacombs suggests that those who commissioned them believed their main audience to be the deceased close relatives who knew the name anyways, or most importantly, the divine Lord. God already knew their names, since their names were written in his book of life and in heaven, known from the Bible, and he could therefore easily decipher monograms illegible to passers-by. Finally, the growing popularity of monograms must have resulted from the widely shared late antique belief in the intercessory and protective powers of graphic signs, exemplified by the popularity of undecipherable occult characters, known as characteres, in the magical practices of the Roman world sometime from the 1st and 2nd century of our era. Magical characters were used by their practitioners to empower textual amulets. These occult signs were seen as graphic marks with liminal qualities capable of making a human request heard by transcendent forces. The existing large corpus of occult characters suggests that their practitioners often improvised while drawing these signs. In fact, the recent article argues that there were only 12 signs that repeated quite often, while the vast majority of signs appears only in one or two texts or amulet, which means that the practitioner just improvised and created a sign that's supposed to look like a really powerful sign. So it's not a precise form, but rather a style that made such marks magical, so to speak, in the eyes of their producers and recipients. The same belief in the liminal power of graphic marks inspired graphic marginalia in the Gnostic book of the Great Initiatory Discourse that has been preserved in the Bruce Codex, currently in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. In this Coptic translation of a late 3rd or 4th century Greek original, the resurrected Jesus Christ takes his disciples on a mystic ascension towards the true invisible God Yeo, and provides them with the esoteric tools necessary to access divine treasuries hosting multiple types and emanations of that God. These arcane tools consist of passwords, ciphers or numbers, and particular graphic seals, thus treating graphic signs inspired by late Roman sigillography as graphic keys to the transcendent world. The book also treats such graphic devices as protective seals for the disciples, enabling their spiritual transformation during the ritual of triple baptism. Visually, many late antique monograms look not much different from those occult characters and esoteric seals, and their growing usage in late antiquity must have been facilitated by a general belief in the intercessory powers of such graphic devices in communication with the transcendent world. Similar perceptions, as well as an increasing belief in the miraculous powers of the sign of the cross, gave birth to invocational cruciform monograms that requested divine assistance and protections. And from the 6th century onwards, these signs became a common occurrence on early Byzantine seals. The most popular among them addresses the Mother of God, known in Greek as Theotokos, and Mother of God, help your servant. Similar invocations can be found on other early Byzantine material artifacts, such as a reliquary belt buckle from Munich, for example, and the tip of a belt set from the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, both produced between the late 6th and 8th centuries and embellished with cruciform monograms reading, Mother of God, help. Similar invocative monograms can be found on a 7th century gold earring from the Art Museum of the Rhode Island the Rhode Island School of Art, and here, in Providence, by the way, and a couple of early Byzantine rings at the Dumbarton Oaks collection, which invoke both Theotokos and the Lord for help. Another popular early Byzantine cruciform monogram encoded the two divine attributes, life and light. These attributes were also viewed as the symbolic promise of salvation to all the Christians, which might have encouraged their joint use in an intercessory graphic device. This cruciform monogram appeared on various early Byzantine material artifacts such as lamps, rings, cross pendants, textiles, belt buckles, and sepulchral crosses found in different parts of the Mediterranean world. The popularity of these intercessory graphic signs stretched beyond the core Byzantine territories and reached as far as southern Spain in the west and Nubia in the south. In some Eastern Christian regions, such as Coptic Egypt and Nubia, people relied on the miraculous protection not only of the Lord and the Mother of God, sometimes there was also mention of the Holy Trinity, but also of Archangel Michael. Consequently, the monograms of his name also must have been invested with some sort of apotropaic power. This can be inferred from the recent detailed study of a mummified corpse of a young Christian woman buried in Nubia near the village at Taraif in modern Sudan, around between 655 and 775. She had a box monogram, Michael, with the sign of the cross on its top tattooed on the inner thigh of the right leg. There had been a tradition of placing tattoos on female bodies in this area in the pre-Christian period, and scholars have connected this earlier tradition to the idea of fecundity and healing practices. The box monogram of Michael might have been used in a similar healing procedure, or it was tattooed as a graphic protective seal of the kind that was mentioned in the Bruce Codex. In late antique elite culture, Neoplatonic ideas provided more sophisticated trappings for such popular beliefs in liminal qualities of monogrammatic devices, as can be illustrated by the dedication page in the calendar of 354, produced in 354. Embellished with an impressive acclamatory monogram unique for late antique manuscript culture. On the top of the page, a letter O frames a monogram encoding an acclamation written by its sides, namely, Valentine flores in Deo, which means Valentinus, may you flourish in God. The purpose of the monogram was therefore not linguistic. It was created to provide the acclamation with a non-linguistic graphic form. The circular monogram invites its viewer to interpret the phrase as a graphic image, thus leading them from the realm of literacy to the realm of graphicacy, in which the linguistic substrate held a subservient position to the norms of graphic visualization. The purpose of this monogram was not only to honor the manuscript's recipient with a visual acclamation capable of directly addressing divine forces, but also to unlock its viewer's contemplative state of mind with hidden visual references to Neoplatonic ideas. Firstly, the decoding of this monogram requires a circular counterclockwise eye movement, if you go letter by letter, which brings to mind Neoplatonic ideas about the circular motion of the human soul on its ascendance to the divine. Secondly, Valentinus' monogram presented this Roman aristocrat not in the mimetic form of the sensible world, so to speak, but in his likeness to intelligible reality. I'm using very Neoplatonic terms here. It's this second graphic mode of representation that revealed the true nature of the man in the eyes of the late antique Neoplatonists. And this view was later adopted by mystical Christianity as presented, for example, in the works of Pseudo-Dionysius. The widespread belief in the intercessory powers of graphic science and Neoplatonic influences alone cannot account for the frequent appearance of aristocratic personal monograms on various luxury objects in the late Roman and post-Roman worlds from the 5th century onwards. The increasing use in this period also fulfilled an important social function. The Roman author Julius Victor stated in his Ars Rhetorica that cryptic language was permissible among close acquaintances who were able to understand it using an obscure code which they agreed upon. The aristocratic personal monograms operated as just such a cryptic quasi-language. They encoded meanings decipherable only to those within small circles of noble donors, recipients, owners, and wearers of prestige objects, but were obscure to people on the outside. Such graphic devices concealed personal names from uninvited gazes, but were easily understood within the social and family environments inhabited by those whose names such monograms encrypted. Calligraphic personal monograms thus increased social cohesion by establishing visual borders to outsiders. Only people within restricted social networks of power and affluence, familiar with each other's name and proficient in a shared code of monogrammatic calligraphy, were able to decipher such monogrammatic signs. And this social cultural ability set them apart from other people. Consequently, calligraphic monograms developed as ennobling graphic devices in the course of the 4th and 5th centuries. And by the 6th and 7th centuries, they became an immanent part of a new visual Christian paideia affecting private headquarters as well as public spaces. In these centuries, late Roman and early Byzantine emperors, early medieval kings and bishops also appropriated calligraphic personal monograms to express their authority on material objects, such as coins, signet rings, and luxury objects. They also employed their personal monograms to mark public spaces they claimed as their own, especially inside churches such as Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, San Vitale in Ravenna, or San Clemente in Rome. In the latter function, such monumental monograms were carved side by side with the sign of the cross and functioned as visual reminders of the transcendent sources of imperial and episcopal authority to anyone visiting their churches. After all, God was viewed as the ultimate source of authority in the early Middle Ages. Furthermore, along with other Christian signs and symbols, monumental monograms functioned as liminal graphic markers of ritual and liturgical spaces. And their proliferation in this medium in late antiquity can also be explained with a reference to Jasz Elsner's concept of ritual-centered or mystic visuality that became a hallmark of Byzantine and medieval art in contrast with the mimetic visuality of the classical world. According to Elsner, ritual-centered visuality is linked to liturgical or ritual space where the viewer and the divinity directly confront each other. Such liminal space is the zone where the natural and supernatural worlds converge within a highly ritualized context. To enter this liminal space, the viewer has to undertake a journey, either physical journey, mundane journey, or spiritual, or both. This space is dominated by ritual-centered visuality, the aim of which, quote, is to undermine the multiple discourses of the social arena, the screen of signs produced by and carried over from everyday life. Instead, the pilgrim is put through a process of purification of body and mind, in which the self is prepared in a liminal space for the meeting with a being from the other world. From late antiquity onwards, this process of purification of body and mind while entering liminal ritual space included the active use of special graphic marks, such as the occult signs, magical characters, the sign of the cross, Christograms, and last but not the least, monograms. Byzantine emperors and early medieval bishops claimed an intermediary role between the earthly world and the transcendent sphere, either for being uniquely selected by God or for being able to reach out to God via liturgical means. Consequently, their monogrammatic signs were as adequate as the traditional Christian signs to mark the ritual venue where the two worlds converge. It's this late antique ability of monograms both to demarcate and to breach the borders between the mundane and divine, between an authority and its subjects, and between high status and popular culture that transformed such graphic signs from pragmatic marks of producers into visual markers of various authorities with liminal qualities. For the very same reason, monograms could be appropriated in late Roman and post-Roman Mediterranean visual culture to mark an elevated status. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ildar. We have time for questions. I'm sure there are some.
Thanks very much, Ildar. About your monograms, I'm curious about the sequence in which the letters are read. And you referred to one that specifically reads counterclockwise. And I was wondering, since I'm convinced by your argument that these in your period are tied up with a kind of mystic relevance, symbolic mysticism, I don't know when in Catholic behavior the custom of crossing oneself physically entered as a symbol that one would make with a gesture in different contexts. But it occurred to me that the reading of some of these mimics that crossing of oneself in its sequencing, down, up, left, right, something like that. And I wondered if there was any coding to the sequencing within a monogram of the order in which you decoded the letters.
There was a development. When we look at the early monographs, especially monograms, Latin monograms from Roman catacombs, they're still very close to literacy in the way that the letters often organized from left to right. And it's very much similar to your Filipiano's monogram, where text develops from the left to the right. So, and this change is happening from the second half of the 4th and 5th century. And usually you can read more symbolic meanings in the monographs of in a manuscript, for example, or monograms of people who were known for their calligraphic skills. And an example here is this monogram, which is the first monogram ever put by an emperor on his bronze coins, and this is Theodosius II, who had a nickname calligrapher. He is known for that he wrote, it's attributed that he wrote a Bible, a text of a Bible in the form of where every page, text on each page is arranged in the form of a sign of the cross. And it was very high start of the way of presenting text of the Bible in the early Middle Ages, especially in Byzantium. And so this is his first monogram, and if you start deciphering it, what is strange here that it using mostly Latin letters, and Latin letters were used in early Byzantium all the way until the early 6th century. But then you have delta, and the only explanation for putting delta here is the graphic arrangement, because in Latin monograms, D would be attached to a vertical bar on the top or on the bottom. It would never be attached the way how it's attached. But if we look to the letters, we are going T, H, E, and then O, D, and we have a crossing gesture. So he creates a crossing gesture by his own monogram. Yeah. And he always does it very consciously, especially because we know that this emperor is his sister and his wives were the first empresses that put the sign of the cross on their gold coins. Special type of coins, simices, 2/3 of solidus, that are known to be produced for ceremonial purposes. So, and the first time is the sign of the cross is appearing, and then the entire cult of the cross is taken off in the early 4th century, exactly in history. So this is an example of how monogram provides extra linguistic symbolic meaning. And of course it's difficult to trace it everywhere, but the transition from box monograms to cruciform monograms that took place in the 6th century, especially in the reign of Justinian the first, is hardly accidental, because it's exactly that emperor who is known for the closing of Athenian Academy, for paganism, for purchase of pagans. So it's the watershed dividing Neoplatonic pagan world of the Rome from early Christian Byzantine world. And that's exactly when people showing their Christian affiliation, not only the words, but they want to show that they're cruciform monogram, that they're Christian.
Thank you.
A word that comes to my mind when looking at these monograms is cryptography. I think that is maybe appropriate, for instance, in their use for religious purposes, hiding your name because it's known to God anyway, and hiding them for anyone who might appropriate your name for magical purposes. As cryptograms, we would now say, as scholars, they invite to decipher. I mean, if you see such a thing, you want to take it apart and see what is the name, and see there is a system in it. But I wonder if where the cryptograms, the monograms, made to be seen by human eyes, are they meant to be deciphered? And if so, are they meant to be deciphered by a certain type of people who are not only literate, but who are also versed in the decipherment of this type of monograms?
Oh, it all depends on the context, but if we are thinking of these monograms, they were intended for being deciphered by a very tight aristocratic elite who know the calligraphic norms of monograms, how to compose a monogram, how to read it. Well, for the rest of society, this would be just visual signs. And if you look at the bronze coins of late Roman and Byzantine emperors in the second half of the 5th century, they were using monograms. They monograms on the reverse of their coins, and they look differently. Even if you don't read them, if you cannot decipher, you would see them as visual signs very different from each other. So that's why monograms are polysemantic devices that can have different meanings to different audiences. And speaking of cryptic devices, I would think that cryptic devices would mean a much more narrow group of users, and what actually happened that monograms began to be used as cryptic devices in Carolingian monastic culture, when this tradition of using monograms in all kinds of public sphere disappeared, and then monograms are used in manuscripts, in the final lines of the manuscript, where a clerical scribe or abbot or bishop wants to write a line about his work, about his dedication to God, and present his name, but present his name in a very humble way. And then the name won't be given out. The name will be recorded with the monogram, while the text could be written with different scripts. They can use runic, they can use Greek, they can use other type of script for this cryptic line, where the main text is for Latin. And then it's a culture of clerical intellectuals that using this as a cryptic device that is open only to a very small group of people inside.
Yes.
So I'm interested in the graphic composition of monograms. The ones that you set before us today are largely the vertical and the horizontal are roughly equal, as if obviously in some cases to fit within a circle, or even as in the bottom right case here, sort of, where they're equal. Are there monograms ever that are differently oriented, where the vertical and horizontal axes are skewed? Are there things that we could be looking at in terms of, or are they really all set in the same sort of in a rough square or circle
Well,
orientation?
the shape of monograms was changing over the course of 4 or 5 centuries, so there were fashions, and you can actually date many of them just by the way they look. So box monograms are was original, the earliest ones, and they were used more or less through the whole period. So cruciform monograms were introduced in the 6th century, and then they became the most popular, the dominant, probably 80–90% of monograms in the 7th, 8th, 9th century would be cruciform monograms in Byzantium. But in the 7th century, there was also a new type of monograms that became quite popular, a bar monogram that was created along the vertical axis. And it's similar to this Palmate laurel monogram, which also has the same. And it's a third type that can be found in the 7th and 8th century. Well, then there is another type, the Merovingian type, that develops in
France in the 6th century. And then monograms are created, you can recognize them immediately because they look very much similar to house with pointed roof. So the vertical bars are connected either on the top or on the bottom with a letter on the top. And actually, Avitus describing his monogram as a bishop from art, saying, well, have you seen my monogram that should be written in a circle? So this idea that they obviously there were certain rules that were changing. And speaking of reading and understanding, there is a very good reference to a monogram by Aurelius Timaeus written at the end of the 4th century, who says that, to his friend, by the way, have you seen my monogram that magis intelligi quam legi, which should be more understood or interleg, or read between lines, or comprehended or contemplated than read. So obviously for that person, the looking and decoding monogram was a process different from reading. And this is the most important for me because you have such references where people actually indicate that this process is not reading it, so we shouldn't mix it with literacy.
Well, I just had a comment because it seemed to me there were interesting descendants of these devices, which are beyond the remit of your paper, but one of which is a kind of signature that I see all the time in Latin America, which is almost a hieroglyph, which has all of these formal embellishments. And when someone in a formal document, Guatemala, for instance, wishes to sign it in front of a legal notary, it is like no signature we would do in this country, or probably in Europe, as hooks coming down and there were other sorts of devices. And to my knowledge, no one's ever really done a study of this, but they've all struck me as being more sign than writing. It's very difficult to disentangle them. So those are complicated form of what you're describing, probably descendant. But another one that's really fascinating and still continues in some of the northern European monarchies is the royal cipher, which you simply have a single letter, usually it's symmetrically arranged, and the crown on top suggests that it's an alternative way, a more informal way of showing a royal coat of arms, but also the person of that royal personage. And it's not just the king, but also people underneath. What's fascinating there is that they're simplifying. They'll only show the first letter of the name, because famously among royalty, they don't have family names, generally speaking. All that's important is their unique, almost social linguistic privilege is to be known by their title and then by their personal name. But I suspect they're coming by some complicated descent from what you're describing here. It might be interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much. But they all deriving from the same late antique and early medieval tradition. Then coat of arms appears also as a new form of aristocratic identity.
Yeah, so that I would suspect the ciphers are a blending of these two different semiotic systems.
Yeah. All right, Jamil, thanking Ildar once again.
All right, very good. Thank you for your patience. So it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker in the session on divine signs, Bérénice Gaillemin, who comes to us from the Laboratory of Social Anthropology. I'm going to spare you my dreadful French, in Paris. So please join me in welcoming Bérénice.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, John and Stefan. I don't know where he is. I'm going to start with an apologize because of my English. I'm going to speak slowly and I'm going to read my text. I'm sorry. So. I don't know, push, yeah, okay. Catechesis is a component of the evangelical mission of Christianity. Educating Christians means teaching them the Christian doctrine, also called catechism. This formal presentation contains two types of sacred text, prayers Sign of the Cross, Lord's Prayer, Hail Mary, etc., and list of commandments and precepts. Each of these texts during the modern period and still nowadays were to be memorized by heart, and most of the time a set of texts were and are presented in printed catechisms. In order to evangelize colonial America, the missionaries learned the language of the natives, Nahuatl, Quechua, etc., and translated the entire doctrine. Even though these catechisms were printed in Mexico, Lima, and elsewhere, and circulated widely, missionaries often focused on an oral performance of the Christian doctrine. In Latin America, pictorial catechisms have also been produced. And various writings, I'm using the term writing, but I'm going to open the topic, I hope. Similar to mnemonic devices have been designed since the late 16th century. In particular, several pictographic manuscripts, also called testerion, were created in New Spain or Mexico between the late 16th century and the 19th centuries. My doctoral dissertation was devoted to the study of these manuscripts, which have been isolated from their context since their recollection. My work provides a framework for analyzing the entire corpus of testerion manuscripts and building a more systematic historical context for their production and use. So just a sample, no? We can read them like that. So for example, this is the Lord's Father. So our Father, who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. So I could go on, and there are notebooks with a lot of double pages, as you see, with all the prayers and lists and precepts. No? So we can read them, and also with a systematic comparison between different pictures, but also with printed versions of catechism made at different times by various religious orders and in different languages. This methodology, applying this comparison, allows for a more insightful and innovative understanding of the two corpora and provides a foundation for addressing questions about production, date, links to religious orders, and the underlying phrases encoded by their pictures. These manuscripts are original and uncommon. It cannot be denied. It's a real pleasure to go ahead and decipher them, finding new clues to date them, and giving more information for the history of missionaries' methods, in some way the history of writing, the history of indigenous Spanish encounters, etc. But a major problem still remains. What can we say about the real use of these unusual manuscripts? How can we think about them in a pragmatic way? Indeed, the role of the pictures is more complex than a simple way of communication destined for illiterate people. And it's also not easy to manipulate them. It combines all types of cognitive ways of memorization and different senses: sight, touch, but also hearing. So to answer these questions about pragmatic use and efficacy, the comparative method and the use of data from fieldwork in Bolivia can help us better understand this material. As we are going to see, fieldwork also brings news, interrogation, and issues. So yes, I was lucky to find in the Andes a living tradition related to pictographic catechisms. There, an even more singular technique is currently still in use, more precisely in various indigenous communities that live in the municipality of San Lucas in Bolivia. The Quechua Catholic texts are transcribed into a three-dimensional writing. They are used for a punctual teaching that takes place during Lent. Figures are assembled in spiral on a disc made of clay, and each disc is called torta, pie, galette, or rezo, a prayer. No? The signs are handcrafted with clay and mixed with various materials such as plants, pieces of cloth, wool, etc. They transcribe words or syllables. For example, to transcribe the word sin, the sign they employ uses symbolic elements. It associates the weight of the guilt with a load of wool peeled on the shoulders of a man represented by a little stick. However, these documents usually stand out by their generous use of phonograms. So I'm sorry about that. I just to remember that those phonograms are attached only with one language. So here English, of course. And now I'm going to show you examples. So connected with Quechua. So in the Quechua transcription system, signs encode nominal and verbal stems, personal pronouns, various suffixes such as plurals. For example, a piece of cloth, Pacha, encodes the word earth, Pacha, in the sequence of the Lord's Prayer, your will be done on earth. No? Elsewhere, playing on the approximate homophony between the two terms, the plural suffix kuna is frequently noted with a grinding stone, huna. Placed one after each other, the items compose sentences. In the Lord's Prayer, we can read this sequence. So, our Father in heaven, who is, with a lot of puns, no? And so it works like that. Without a doubt, the use of this method is very efficient in terms of memorization. It is based on the use of rebuses and benefits from the educational and playful characteristics of pictures. Nevertheless, one wonders why it is used. In fact, nowadays, the production of these sacred texts is an independent activity, not controlled by the church. It is indeed not imposed by the priest who lives in the principal town, doesn't speak Quechua, teaches catechism in Spanish at church, and gives the sacraments in Spanish. In summary, the prayers pronounced during marriage or confession are not formulated in Quechua. Furthermore, students who use the three-dimensional devices, mostly children, are all educated and literate. So, who is in charge of this activity? Why are these objects produced each year? What does a pragmatic study of these texts tell us about how the practitioners of these communities enter into dialogue with their religion? To address these questions, I will present some avenues of research relying on the physical characteristics of this method. I think it's, I don't know, it's mixed, but okay. So it's a technique that is both fixed arranged on the ground, three-dimensional and ephemeral. So I'm going to start with this characteristic. So the Bolivian state is divided into departments and municipalities. The municipality of San Lucas itself is divided into districts and communities. Sorry. Indigenous communities are kind of small villages and hamlets. For example, the district of Patcoyo is composed of 11 communities. Each year, a different community of the district shall conduct the election of the persons in charge of teaching catechism. The teachers, their assistants, and those responsible for feeding them. In this way, these responsibilities rotate each year and are equally distributed among the communities. It's the so-called load system. I'm sorry, I'm going to turn some more. It's for you because I know that it sounds. So these people gather in small village churches or other outbuildings. There, the texts are taught using the prayer discs. But unlike other practices, where the same book, single or duplicate, exists beforehand, here the fabrication of the texts themselves is also an integral part of the catechesis. So the people in charge meet, usually for a full day, to elaborate clay texts, model and associate the elements among themselves. Subsequently, during the teaching period, seniors attend during the day, while children attend after school and or on weekends. The community's authorities require each household to send at least one of its members for a determinate number of days. An inventory of attendance is recorded, and a fine is to be paid in case of absence. In consequence, the elaboration as well as the learning process are collective and mandatory activities, both at the district, community, and home level. It is also expensive, as it leads to monetary expenses, displacement, and abandonment of agricultural activities over a long period. The materiality of these texts, fixed to the floor, also involves a collective and oral learning. In the manner of some oversized sacred books, these texts are irremovable, and it's impossible to continue their reading individually outside of the imposed framework. To transmit the content, the teacher reads and guides the students with a wand directed towards the signs. Then he corrects or directs gradually the students along their recitation, which sometimes intermingles with his own reading. The whole lesson takes the form of non-continuous repetitions, and through this repetition, the student appropriates the musical text of statements, always repeated identically. So I've got some videos. It's because of that it was very heavy. I don't know if it's going to work, but yes, we're going to watch. No, cannot open the specified file. Maybe yes, I'm going to try. So Let's see.
Bajibams mamai no kaigure ujrimar ge khabai jawishni idem no kaiguma koterjim ge khargai bajibams bachu chugai chepituku wisaigiman pagarimisos polianoida rekichubai ai mamai alkipai oyampai nyugi vihimari santo yuspamama una no kanchi kuchasaponare una diosman tamanya pason chapun chisikres kostais nestam tarba.
Okay, and the the marks.
Santa Maria na paigi canta pargami eran gatos canta pargami eran pagarim zondbach ay khoswarkas.
So there are several in the same moment. Because of that now we are hearing the others. I think you understood the idea. So it takes hours, all day. No, this is another lesson. No, with the children. Yes, I don't want you to memorize it, so I'm going to stop here. But yes, so it's another kind of repetition, no? So let's come back with that now. Where is it?
I got it right here.
Okay. Thank you. So although it's yes. Although it's not a lesson with comments or special exegesis, reading is never isolated or silent, and memorization is systematically associated with oral repetition. The dynamic nature of this teaching lies in the combination of visual tricks with their pronunciation. That's the cognitive process related to the figure's decipherment. Indeed, it is often impossible to understand a pun without articulating aloud. Not only is a riddle often approximate, but it sometimes gives only the beginning, middle, or end of a word. The reader must reconstruct the word in its entirety afterward. For example, the Spanish loan, penitencia, penance, is transcribed by a peine, a comb. No? It is in this context of verbalization that the homophonic wordplay forming the catechetical rebuses acquire their full meaning. Furthermore, since it is the reader's responsibility to recompose the missing words and sounds, the learning process is necessarily associated with a teaching delivered simultaneously for memorization purposes. It is also interesting to underline that pictures act as triggers. Seeing them or moving the wand in their direction reactivates the memories. From a cognitive perspective, this can be compared to similar situations where texts are memorized by singing them, which are later hard to remember without singing the same tune or finding its rhythm. To see and to hear are the two essential components of learning, and one can't be done without the other. And also, in fact, these texts are also memorized thanks to music and songs. I've got a video, but maybe I don't have time because I speak very slowly. You want to hear the musicality? Or yeah? Or, yes. Okay. So it's in all the communities, it's the same air. No, it's not that. So yes, I'm going to try maybe like that. So yes, it's always this music, and yes, it works. I can assure you that hours hearing the music, it comes, and you have seen the helper of the master now with his ones also. So they are part of the lessons. So now let's see the second characteristic, the placement on the ground. The texts are not only fixed, they are laid on the floor. This converts the practice in a penitential and ritual activity. Indeed, reading something written on the floor makes the reader adopt a specific position, painful, literally associated with humility, no, from humus. Now, this teaching happens during Lent, a period of fasting during which abstinence and prayer prepare for Easter. It is thus possible to think that this position transcribes into gestures the penitential part of this period. Furthermore, yes, the elaboration of this text includes libations and collective consumption of alcohol and coca leaves. These rituals are associated with the Pachamama, the chthonic deity worshipped since pre-Columbian times. This is not uncommon in the Andes, where the Pachamama is omnipresent. But those actions convert into a ritual what could be taken as a simple instruction. To this reference is added the very materiality of texts. These prayers are made of clay and are physically contiguous to the ground, which is often made of earth itself. This way, they seem to come out of the ground and appear literally as indigenous, autochthonous elements. Let us continue our analysis of the physical characteristics of these writings. So these are texts in 3 dimensions. Yes, from the production stage, and because the text begins with the outer edge of the disc, yes, the writer must evaluate and anticipate the size of the disc before he disposes the words and syllables. As the clay dries quickly, repentance is hardly possible. The disc size is usually adequate to the number of figures placed on it, as we can see. Apart from this example, it is rare to see a rather airy disc or a prayer that has been cut due to space limitation. So the 3-dimensionality thus provides the writer or the marker with the opportunity to show his virtuosity. The 3-dimensional nature of this practice is correlated with its performative aspect. Yes, whenever a torta, a galette, is read, a prayer is also made aloud. The text is also open, impossible to close. There is no cover, it's not a wall, and no page can be turned. Considered this way, from the time the disc is modeled and objects, words, are arranged on its surface, a prayer is offered in plain sight, or it even occurs. It goes without saying that the name of the disc, rezo, meaning prayer, is also important. The disc is in itself a prayer, which is later produced and formulated in a collective way. In addition, the semiotics disrupts the sentences and the entire text. The words and syllables of the prayers come one after the other, continuously. They are carried away from the outside to the inside, following the spiral pattern. This circular movement, which is not interrupted by punctuation, paragraph, or any frame page, is then exposed to the constant flow of its vocalization, itself associated with a sort of psalmody. Finally, the texts are wound. This way, they can be read by several students simultaneously. Masters and catechumens are not forced to stand in front of the text, and therefore they are settled in groups around it. But beyond this practical aspect, the general three-dimensional arrangement of the prayers in the whole building leads to spatial knowledge. Known as the art of memory, this method has been known since the antiquity by orators, followed by missionaries as part of the Christian rhetoric. And we found here a typical associations of words and images, or content and places, all facilitating memorization. Here on the floor, it is almost a mental map that the faithful may mentally use during the stages of remembering. In addition, a student moves from one text to another by following a strict order. And texts are stored one after the other. Ideally, and in an instant, he can list all the texts that have been taught to him. Using the same method, he can, as well as the master, evaluate its own progress in situ. Now, I'm going to finish with that. I must add that the existence of this writing contradicts the ideas typically associated with writing. No? Verba volant, scripta manent. In our case, the writing of prayers is an ephemeral production. At Easter, all the rezos are destroyed. This can be explained by practical considerations. With use and time, the flowers fade, cracks widen, and clay crumbles. This also promotes the rotation of these activities among the community members and the cyclic nature of education. Thus, the various traditions are regenerated, and the knowledge is passed and recurs, also varies from year to year. These writings cannot be reduced to effective tools for illiterate populations. Their use is far from easy, and even if they may have been created or imposed in a colonial context, they no longer have the same features. We have indeed seen that the production and use of these original texts go with many political, artistic, semiotic, ritual, kinetic, and sensitive actions. Those actions give movement and revive every year the whole community. The strength of this movement is Easter, when communities proudly meet together, mostly in town, and literally sing and scream, in Spanish, gritan, prayers in Quechua, during long procession where the first place is given to children. To conclude, I propose that despite the semiotic characteristics of this writing, which is a logosyllabic one, the populations who decide to make it, learn because of it, and also destroy it, are really each year making a mark. Even if almost each sign is associated with a word or a syllable, the activity per se makes visible different values shared by those populations. The first choice made by the markers resides in the decision made to use the technique and not a common prayer book written with other type of writings as the alphabet. Then the political authorities decide to elect the personnel in charge of this activity. And instead of an election, the way of deciding who is going to be in charge is more an imposition, as the people doesn't do a campaign, doesn't present their candidature, and haven't the possibility of denying the choice made by their local authorities. But this is the point. In fact, all the process make also visible the whole political organization of those communities, where each inhabitant have to participate at different moments of their life, depending on age, knowledge, or abilities. 2 minutes? Yes? Third, converting little pictures into a three-dimensional format also transforms a text into a set of material objects directly taken from the natural and cultural surrounding of these populations. Doing that, each disc is not only a text to memorize, but also a representation in reduction, a miniaturization of the landscape. This is a ceremony. And plants, animals, agricultural activity, weaving, and even the modeling itself reflects the daily life and the different values in which these populations can recognize themselves. This way, pictures and objects surely represent more than what the Catholic prayers do, be it in Quechua, even sometimes in archaic Quechua or in Spanish. Indeed, the Catholic doctrine itself, recited or written in an alphabetic way, doesn't have the same connotations than those attached to these three-dimensional ways of depicting belief. In fact, even the puns are bilingual and reflect a certain way of speaking in these villages. People switch from one language to another, from Spanish to Quechua, depending on the place they speak or the moment, and mix the two languages since more than 4 centuries. To conclude this presentation, I would like to propose that all these features explain why today this technique is taken as a mark of identity, an activity described by their users as well by their neighbors, and sometimes as well by some Bolivian anthropologists as Indian or even as pre-Columbian technique. From my point of view, this is not a debate we can solve here, but this means that a technique, as well as its content, first imposed by missionaries or European priests, can transform itself into something else. The projection made into these devices, the definition itself has been converted across time by the users themselves in a way that affirms and claims their own identity. Sorry, thank you. I'm sorry.
Rich and layered presentation. We have time for questions.
In Japan, in the 7th and 8th century, when writing, which was Chinese writing, was first introduced, when at first the Japanese only wrote in Chinese, and gradually, and this happened roughly in the early 8th century, they started trying to produce texts of their own using the building blocks of Chinese, and they used them in ways that, in many ways, that are strikingly similar. They're obviously not three-dimensional, but they used Chinese characters sort of as rebus-like building blocks. And for quite a while early on, which Chinese character would be adopted for its meaning, which one would be adopted for its pronunciation, which one would be assembled how, was idiosyncratic and changed from text to text. And indeed, once the Japanese regularized their usage, they kind of forgot these early experiments, which became more or less illegible for later readers. So so I'm wondering, maybe you said this, but I'm wondering if you can elaborate on this, and maybe I missed it and you can elaborate. The specific decisions that are made about individual words or individual sounds, are those renewed and different from year to year, from prayer to prayer, or are certain words, you know, is the brush always the penance, is the, or do those get renegotiated every time by different teachers?
Thank you for this question. Yes, it's hard to compare because they are destroyed. But yes, I went there 3 times, so I can see that it changes from one community to another. There are like kind of traditions. Also, it changes from year to year because some of the masters are innovating now with new signs, and also because in the 80s I didn't have the opportunity to show you that, but I take the advantage of this question. Because in the 80s, a priest thought it was a very interesting tradition, so he published a book. So it's not that, okay, yes, yes. So yes. This is a book edited in 1988, and so it's there are pictures taken from the computers, no, like Paint, this logiciel software, and so. He distributed the book in several communities, and when they have forgotten the tradition, they copy the book. But there are a lot of misunderstanding with time. Sometimes they don't understand the puns, or so they are created new signs, also because the 2 dimension in 3 dimension is not always easy, and they are also creating new readings, new exegesis of the picture. So yes, it varies with time, and there are different traditions. So here we can see that in this community they have forgotten how to make the marks. and they copy directly the book. Even in this slide, no, I don't know if you see here, but it's the name of the prayer, and page 28 is mentioned. So, yes, there are a lot of variations.
I realize, as you, this is fabulous presentation, fascinating. I realize that you aren't necessarily interested in trying to trace the origins of this practice to either Spanish or indigenous practices. But I am curious if you've seen other precedents or analogous examples at the level of form of using the circle, a progression, a sort of linear progression through the spiral and in 3 dimensions. If you see that in other parts of your research.
Thank you. Yes, the origins of the method are very difficult to trace, and yes, it's not my focus. I try to understand when it starts, and the oldest is from the beginning of the 20th century. But yes, there are anthropologists who are doing comparison with some signs in caves and things like that. But yes, it's not my way. But yes, we can compare with the formal, the characteristics, with offerings made in Quechua and Aymara area called mesas. So yes, they've got the same aspect, more or less, but they are not read like a writing, and it's not in spiral, but they've got little objects, meaning things, offerings, symbolic meanings. So I have to dig a little bit more this topic, but yes, I think there are things to compare also with the offerings made during different rituals and the use of clothes, material pushed into the, not pushed, made into the ground. So yes, directly characteristic of being in the ground is very important, I think. I'm sorry for my English. It's terrible. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Berenice. As often, I'm interested in directionality. And I was wondering if there's any point to the fact that the spirals run counterclockwise, which seems to be counter to both the linear organization of the rebus reading from left to right, and also from the natural sequence of the clock. So it's pointedly adopting a contrary directionality to the way you read these prayer circles, I guess. Was that to market as something different, something? In antiquity, for example, often a significant change of orientation would signal a different space, like a sacred space or a public or private space. It was a way of marking territoriality or categorization. Do you find any of that coding in your physical prayers, if you like, the three-dimensional prayers?
Yes, of course, the way of reading them, I'm sorry, I speak about writing and reading, but I hope I showed that it was more or other, is very important, and for Latin American anthropologists is very common, the anti-horary sense of lecture. Yes, it has to be with the sun and the course of the sun, and all the rituals, the dances are in this sense. So yes, it's a very indigenous way of conceiving the reading, and yes, I think it's a very important mark indeed, and. And if it's not in spirals, because I've got also some notebooks with drawings to help them memorize each year how to make the 3D figures. And sometimes it's in boustrophedon. So this lecture also is very typical.
All right, well, I think if you don't mind, just so you can actually keep the trains on schedule, we can continue discussing both of these fascinating papers at our reception. But before that, please join me in thanking Berenice for a fascinating.
Thank you.